the Unplugged. Sorry, I got to mess with your recording. Welcome to our June Unplugged event, Home Ownership and the American Dream. We are so excited to be partnering with Blend and several panelists today to have this important conversation about the unique experiences about home ownership and what it means for those of us living with disabilities. And for those of you who do not know, Diversability is a community and an organization committed to elevating disability pride together. And these events are some of the hallmark things that help us do that, letting you have your opportunity as people in the disability community to have your voices heard and make the impact that we're all looking for. And before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. The chat is open, so you are welcome throughout the event to post your questions, make comments, give your resounding yes to those things that you agree with. We love hearing those comments from you. And if you are not actively asking a question at the end of the event, please make sure and keep your mute on so that we can have as little background noise as possible, so that our presenters have a chance to be heard by as many people as possible. And as always, let's keep the conversation community-centered and respectful of one another so that as many people as possible are able to participate in today's event. And without further ado, other than that, I'm going to turn it over to our representatives from Blend and get the conversation started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Antonia. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm on the diversity, inclusion, and belonging team here at Blend. If you're not already familiar with Blend, we are a technology company that offers a platform for banks to make lending digital and mobile. And if you've ever gotten a mortgage, and maybe that's part of the reason why you're joining us today, then you know how time-consuming and paper-based it is. So what we do is we just make it simpler and more data-driven so that you can buy a home, a car, or get a loan on any device rather than having to do everything through in-person interactions. We currently enable financial institutions to process an average of more than $4 billion in transactions every day. And in 2020, nearly $1.4 trillion in mortgages and consumer loans flowed through the Blend platform. Knowing that, it may come as no surprise that it makes sense for us to be part of this conversation today around disability and homeownership, and generally just expanding access to homeownership, which is something that is very important to us. And if this mission resonates with you and you're interested in joining what we're doing here at Blend, we would love to connect after the event. Before I hand things over to our moderator for today, I did just want to say that we are so excited to be sponsoring this conversation around disability and home ownership, because at Blend, we have 3 core pillars, which are simplicity, transparency, and accessibility. And we believe that our platform helps provide everyone with an equal seat at the lending table, which in turn expands access to a broad range of financial services, including mortgage and home ownership. So while there's a lot of work that's still to be done to make the path to home ownership as inclusive as possible, which our wonderful panelists will definitely dive into more today, our hope is that this conversation will serve as a jumping off point for all of you to start thinking about the ways that you can make a difference, or to learn something that will hopefully make your personal experience with home ownership more positive and more inclusive. And I just want to echo also what Katie said. We encourage you to comment and ask questions in the chat. But I do want to remind everyone that there is a code of conduct today, so please be respectful and thoughtful with your questions and your feedback. Also, closed captioning is enabled, and there are ASL interpreters here that are supporting us today. Thank you so much. Thank you to Diversability for partnering with us. And with that, I will relinquish the mic to Emily Bilbao, our wonderful moderator today, to introduce herself and our fantastic panelists. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Bilbao. My pronouns are she and her. I work at Blend in strategic operations. I am psyched to be moderating this today. First, a big thank you to Antonia and Katie and their teams for everything they've done to make this happen. It's no small thing, so thank you so much. My plan right now is to provide to have our wonderful panelists introduce themselves before turning to their remarks. We'll then do some Q&A that I'll moderate, and then we'll turn it over to all of you for audience questions. But as has been, said, please use the chat box. By way of a brief background just about myself, what drew me to Blend, and Antonia did such a masterful job explaining what Blend does, but what drew me to this company is its purpose-driven mission to take the friction out of lending and expand access to financial resources, knowing that the impacts on wealth generation and livelihood are profound for individuals, for families, for communities. Previously, I worked in federal government in higher education. So that's my background. And personally, I have experience with this topic. I've purchased 2 homes. I've been very fortunate. And I went through these home buying journeys while actively learning and navigating my identity as someone with a disability, having been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in early-ish adulthood. Turning to our panel, I am thrilled to turn to them for introductions. You should have their full bios in the invitation. I've already learned so much from them in the prep, and I'm so grateful to them for everything I've learned so far. Can't wait for more, and I know you all will as well. Angela, let's start with your intro and we'll go around. Please don't forget to let us know your pronouns. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you, Emily. Hi, everyone. My name's Angela Fox. I go by she, her. For those who are visually impaired, I'm in a electric wheelchair. I'm a white woman, Caucasian. I have brown short hair and I'm wearing a blue blazer with some fancy jewelry. I am a licensed attorney by trade, and I provide civil rights advocacy privately. My day job is working for the federal government, being a mediator and conflict resolution person. So I make the workplace a happier place. And then I also, the reason why I'm involved in today is because I have just recently launched a new podcast called Accessibility is Home. I did this after I was born with my disability. I had scoliosis, fused vertebrae. I've never been able to walk. I'm 39 years old, so I've always dealt with my identity. And I always wanted to have a fully wheelchair accessible house. And I bought my very first home during the Great Recession market crash of housing. And I had a lot of difficulty doing that despite being gainfully employed and my legal expertise. And I wrote a book called My Blue Front Door. It's on Amazon. I also posted in chat my website that has my podcast and my book. And so that's what I do privately right now. So I'm thrilled. And I just want to say thank you so much for Blend and Diversability as well. But the disability home ownership is only going to progress if companies out in housing market actually look into that field. And so I am absolutely thrilled that this is having along the opportunity to be on the panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. Ashley, can I turn it over to you for an introduction?
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Jacobson. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman sitting at a desk in front of a bookshelf wearing a gray blazer and a blue and black blouse. I am also a lawyer. I practice primarily disability rights, and I also have a master's degree in vocational rehabilitation counseling. For those who don't know what that is, because the name can be a bit misleading, rehabilitation counseling is a field devoted to counseling members of the disability community for accommodations and accessibility in homes, in schools, and workplaces. And I'm also a disabled woman. I live with lupus and other chronic illnesses, and I'm really honored to be invited to speak with you all on this super important discussion.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm going to turn it over to Danh.
Hey, everyone. It's so good to see so many familiar faces and names in the chat, and so good to see many of you, and super glad to be here. My name is Yan Trang, pronouns he, his, spelled D-A-N-H, but pronounced yen like the Japanese currency. Asian American, parents are from Vietnam, black hair. In the background that says Mux, the current company that I'm at right now, and wearing some Apple headphones. So I was born with a condition called achondroplasia, which is a form of dwarfism. You can see me there. It's my older brother, my family. Both of my parents were average height, and I got the lucky draw of 1 out of 40,000 to have dwarfism. So much of my lived experience has been as a person with a disability. And as I grew up, I knew early on that numbers and finance was something that was something that would be of high interest to me. Actually, there's a tradition on the first birthday of a kid, the kid picks toys, and depending on the toy that the kid picks, it's supposed to predict their occupation. I didn't know about this until actually after I graduated from Penn with a degree in finance and computer science. But it just so happened that when I was 1 year old, I picked both a dollar bill and a toy computer. And it just so happened that I ended up majoring in finance and computer science. Went to Penn, graduated with perfect timing in the depths of the financial crisis. So I interned at Lehman Brothers. So that was my first exposure into the wild, wild west of the mortgage market. Interned there, and we all know what happened with Lehman Brothers on September 15th, 2008. And then from there, spent a lot of time in finance, both at Citigroup and at Bridgewater, the world's largest hedge fund. And then eventually, I made my way over to a company called, some of you might recognize this office. This was actually the Blend offices back in 2013 and 2014. Joined a company on a mission to help modernize and simplify mortgage and now consumer financing writ large. The company started off small, first with just a few folks, and then the team got a little bigger. It's fun like going through these photos to find some of coworkers, many of whom I know I see online here. Worked to make home lending a little bit better, big homes and small homes, gingerbread houses included. And we grew a ton. And so both my experience in finance and at Blend. And in 2016, I bought my first house in San Francisco. This is the letter that I got from the real estate agent saying that my offer was accepted after many, many rejected offers, and have stories to share there also. So looking forward to sharing more about my perspectives about how technology can help accelerate, simplify, and make more accessible the mortgage and consumer lending process.
Thank you so much, Yan. That was awesome. Nicole Weitzman has not been able to join yet, so I'm going to read her bio to everyone. She, her, or her pronouns. She's a physical therapist assistant and homeowner living in the greater Phoenix area. Nicole's experience as a deaf person, along with her recent endeavor to refinance mortgage her own home, provides a unique perspective on the challenges and opportunities facing the disabled community as they seek homeownership. And once she's able to join, I think Antonia will be able to spotlight her if you're viewing. I will also read her remarks and she'll be available in the chat. I also just want to take a cue as I'm learning. I want to describe myself. I'm a white woman, brown curly hair, sitting in a room with a blurred background to hide the mess of working from home. So with that, what I'd like to do is to kick off with Angela and ask, in addition to your own personal story, if you can help us set the context. What are some of the unique requirements disabled people face in the home purchasing and modification process? How can these potentially be accommodated? I'm going to be asking everyone for their personal experience and then a prompt.
Great. All right. Thank you, Emily. I really enjoyed this particular questions, and to put it in context for disability home ownership. Is really why isn't there not a lot of attention being made to it? And I had kind of talked offline with Emily about this, but traditionally, if you were to Google or you were to ask disability organizations, the focus have been primarily on homelessness as well as low rent, voucher aid programs, financial assistance by the federal government, but it's primarily renting. And I really want to know why this was. And statistically, people with disabilities who have is the largest minority. So for those of you who are new to the community, is 1 out of 4 people do have a disability in America. So we are the largest minority. And depending on what stats you use, 28 to 30% of disability community is in poverty, which I honestly, when I started looking into it, thought it would be much higher, because if the focus is on low income for housing, 30%, that's only a third. But to give some context to, why we need to go beyond those numbers, is if you would compare those who were not in poverty, which is about 41 million, that is larger than the population of African Americans who are not in poverty, which is actually 33 million. So it really goes beyond just numbers and needs, and it's really focusing on that. To answer the question of purchasing a home, is that the disability community, the disabled, we are not considered a viable disabled home buyer. And so that's why I want to provide that context is when we're looking at disability home ownership, the focus may be on, low income rental, because there's a large population within the disability community. But if you go back the numbers and you compare it towards other minority groups that do have special programs for purchasing homes, despite having, members that are in poverty, we don't have that in the disability community. And so I think giving us that context, the first step is, what are the hurdles for purchasing? And one thing that I also personally experienced, there's not a lot of programs out there. Outside of, the 201k HUD, which is a Housing, Urban and Development, a federal agency. If you go on my blog, I research, and there's only about 11 states that have a disability orientated program. Luckily, in the state of Maryland actually has a home ownership for people with disabilities, and that's how I got mine. So that's the first kind of hurdle as far as purchasing a home, is to get beyond that single story about, people with disabilities cannot be a viable home buyer. So I think that's a good, kind of spot to think about what we're doing. But as beyond trying to get a real estate agent, as I kind of described in my book, I was, really thought I would have to pick in the middle of real estate agents during the recession to try to get them to see me as a viable buyer. Another issue for purchasing a home is just the fact that very few accessible homes out there, meaning you will have to go into buying a home. Let me take a step back. Not every disability needs modification. So I think we need, say that out loud. Or some may have some hidden disabilities, and it's more about the location, making sure that, maybe they're close to services or something, not by a busy road, or if they need to be out in the country because a noise may trigger them. So there are a whole bunch of hidden disabilities that's more based on location, or don't even need any modifications at all. But when I'm speaking about accessibility, I'm talking about those who have they'll need some kind of modification to the home. And so only 2% of homes are accessible, meaning they have some kind of modification. So you have a big hurdle that you are going into a market knowing you have to buy a home that's going to need construction, some major construction. Emily, did you want me to go into the modifications?
Yeah, I think that'd be really helpful. Your experience in Maryland, you mentioned earlier about the 11 states having programs that's related to the ability to modify your home in an affordable way, right? Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah,
experience with that?
Yeah, so it's a little bit, it obviously depends on the state. I didn't divide, so there's some states will either do either grants or low interest loans for modifications. Those are generally targeted a particular subcategory of disabilities, meaning you're a disabled vet, you are 65 years or older, you have a child with a disability or low income. Then there are other states that have an actual home ownership program, which the state of Maryland has. Unfortunately, and this is not uncommon, there is a disconnect, meaning I had to go to two separate programs. One was for the buying of the home, which would help people, to get a low interest loan. And I didn't have to put any down payment in the state of Maryland. But then I couldn't get any money to modify my home. I had to go through another Maryland Assisted Technology Loan Program. And luckily, that was just based on being disabled and a Maryland resident. Most of the states I have on my blog for the modification money, it's based on your particular subcategory in the disability community. So that's even a greater hurdle. I'm very privileged that Maryland did not do that. Otherwise, I would not qualify because I'm not a disabled vet, younger than 65, and I was working, so I was a low income. But a lot of the other 11 programs, you really have to look at the details to see if you even qualify. And most states rely on the HUD, which is Housing and Urban Development 201K, which does allow for the loan of the house and loan of the modification. But the loan of the modification is separate, and it's usually at a higher interest rate. And it was much higher interest rate than what the state of Maryland was providing through a state-specific program.
Great. Thank you so much for that context setting. I'm sure there'll be some specific follow-up questions. I already have several. Ashley, I'm going to come over to you and ask you to provide some of your personal experiences as well and help us think about the legal context. What legal context should we be thinking about? What are the legal parameters that borrowers and lenders need to be aware of, and anything else from that perspective?
Thank you. Angela did a great job of touching on some of those legal things already. My personal experience, I've been a renter and a homeowner. I've dealt with specific hurdles when it came to purchasing or finding viable housing with my physical disabilities. So I have some mobility needs. I sometimes use a cane after surgeries, which I have on occasion. I use a walker. But I've also had to think about things like finding a first floor apartment or a ranch style home, finding a home near a hospital for emergencies, a home that's within 2 hours of my main medical team, and also budgeting for living with disability, which can be incredibly expensive, and housing. And so when I think of disability and this issue of housing and the prejudices and the ableism that so many in our community face, there are these personal kind of backgrounds that I have with it, but then I also have a lot of professional context from seeing, unfortunately, a lot of my clients face really kind of inaccessible treatment when it comes to housing. And so when I have clients or really anybody that wants to talk to me about disability and housing, they typically ask a few main questions. So they ask, what laws protect me? What do those laws say? Who's included in those protections? Because it's actually not just the disabled individual in many cases, but also what are some common ways that people with all kinds of disabilities might face discrimination or ableism in housing. And so the laws, as Angela said, can vary by state as well as the programs. But generally, there's the Fair Housing Act or the Fair Housing Amendments Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as the Rehab Act, which cover a lot of scenarios. But again, definitely check with your individual states. And I would recommend, of course, seeking out an attorney in your area if you're dealing with a specific set of circumstances. But when it comes to who's protected by these laws, it's typically very similar to those who are protected under the ADA in general. So someone with a physical or mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more major life activities. And I like to say major life activities are things that you do on a day-to-day basis to care for yourself. So whether it's like moving around or seeing, hearing, speaking, communicating, learning, working, a wide range of activities are covered. But you're also considered to have disability rights if you have a record of having such an impairment, or others treat you as though you have a disability. But when it comes to housing, there's this unique kind of weird exception where in housing, you're not entirely protected to when you have and you're dealing with a substance use disorder, which comes into play a lot recently. I've seen with medicinal marijuana laws in many states. Even if you're using marijuana medicinally, landlords and housing associations can have rules about that, which I think could change in the future with how they're treated under disability rights laws. But essentially, there can be some exceptions for the use of marijuana or for illegal use of substances. And so when we're talking about generally, what are some of the common ways that people with disabilities face discrimination in housing? I see this happen a lot when it comes to a lack of a landlord or, a housing establishment wanting to provide modifications or to make the home accessible or accommodate the individual. Additionally, many lenders and realtors, brokerages, and sellers aren't willing, even when they're required to be, to make the process even palatable or accessible for disabled people. And like Angela highlighted, often homes are not disability accessible, so the cost becomes a factor. But additionally, with the financial aspect, not only is, like I said, expensive to live with a disability, many young adults aren't being either taught or they're not having family members or friends discuss things like credit and home ownership with them, because too often people assume that they just won't be a homeowner because they have a disability, which is really problematic for many reasons. But like I said, some other common issues with disability in housing related to medicinal marijuana. I'm seeing a ton of cases pop up with that, especially in Michigan, because Michigan also legally made, where I live, they made marijuana recreationally allowed. But again, housing is a whole separate ballgame. But also that there's a really high unemployment rate of people with disabilities. And so the financial cost is that much greater when you're having to set aside money for a down payment on a home and $20,000 for a surgery or something along those lines. And so generally, what's not allowed? Generally, people are not allowed to discriminate in a sale or in a rental, or to deny or make a home or an apartment unavailable to a renter or a buyer because the renter or buyer has a disability, or a person living with them or who plans to live with them has a disability, or there's anybody associated with that buyer or renter who has a disability. So it covers a lot of people. And sometimes this looks like different instances. So this could be refusing to provide permits to make reasonable modifications to a home or a rental unit. It could include anything that prevents the person with a disability from enjoying the full use of the premises, when it's not going to be an undue hardship on a landlord or seller or anything like that. But also, when it comes to housing, the refusal to make reasonable accommodations, not just in the physical environment, but in policies and rules that are commonly put in place by landlords, lenders, realtors, and the like.
That was great, Ashley. Thank you. I have so many specific questions, and I'm sure others do too. Both Angela and Ashley have said so much that's resonated with me. Yen, I want to turn it over to you to tell us about your experience and also help us think through the role of technology. What role can technology play in this space? How should borrowers and lenders think about technology?
Totally. So when I was reflecting on this question, I was really thinking about it in three parts. And I think the first two parts, many of the other panelists have covered or will cover. in that I feel that the American dream as it relates to disability homeownership really is impacted by like three main pillars. One, society, what kind of stigmas and prejudices exist currently, and we all know that there are a lot of them. And I think Diversability and events like this are great at broadening that awareness, reducing the stigma. Obviously, change doesn't happen overnight, but hopefully for those who are attending a disability awareness event like this for the first time, the next time you encounter like a slight microaggression or ableist comment, you'll have the tools or awareness to either think about saying something or actually saying something. So I think one of the main hurdles that individuals with disabilities face results from like how society perceives individuals with disabilities. And then the second pillar, which Ashley and Angela had touched upon, is like government. While in general, I'm in favor of like smaller government because I believe that private enterprises are often the best allocator of resources, often that's not always the case. And so like when the invisible hand, quote unquote, is not quite sufficient, that's where government has to step in and like tip the scale in a way that makes sense and is equitable and fair for everyone. And so like Ashley had talked about the Fair Housing Act, which actually it wasn't until the Fair Housing Amendments Act, which Ashley had mentioned, that individuals with disabilities was actually added as a protected class. So it's like 20 years after 1968. First, it was just race, religion, sex, national origin, which is a huge step forward from where we were before that. But it wasn't until like another 20 years after that that individuals with disabilities and a few other protected classes, I think pregnant women as well, were added as a protected class. And it wasn't until 1990 that the American Disabilities Act was formalized. And so the government has done a lot of great things in terms of creating programs like the VA, HUD, to make homeownership more accessible. But it doesn't take too many visits to the DMV or any interactions with government-related organizations or programs to know that like government-related programs leave a lot to be desired. And I think that's where technology comes in. So that was a roundabout way of talking about society, government, and then technology is that third pillar. So while like government can have great intentions, like one only has to look to like the DMV or the recent PPP loan rollouts to show how with the absence of more technology, the right resources weren't being made to the right people. But great companies like Blend and other companies in the industry really can play a big role in helping not only advance the rollout of amazing government programs, but also help government programs add additional accessibility where they're falling short. And then so just to speak to some of those things that I was able to see firsthand while my time at Blend, and for those who are currently at Blend, I'm probably preaching to the choir, and I'm sure there are many additional accessibility things that you have added since I left in 2018. But I know from the time that I was there, having like a mobile first mortgage application was revolutionary. All the loan officers that I talked to back in 2013, 2014 were saying, no one's gonna want to fill it out online. Everyone wants to fill out paper and pen. And while mobile first isn't gonna necessarily be accessible to everyone, it does help people who might be on the go more often or might not be able to go into the loan officer's office to sign certain things. So each incremental innovation really helps make it more accessible to more and more people. Things like making certain documents able to be e-signatured versus wet signed, that makes it more accessible too, not only from a cost perspective, but also from like a accessibility perspective. One of the big projects that I worked on while I was at Blend, and I see some familiar faces now, so I'll throw up Nick, I see you here. Nick and I once did a hackathon together. That's Nick right there. I think he's still at Blend. But one of the like main projects that the product team had worked on while at Blend was essentially integrations with third-party providers. So when you get a mortgage, you need to prove that you have enough money. You need to prove that you make enough money, and you need to prove that you're employed, or of whatever your employment is. And the status quo would be for you to print out pages and pages of bank statements, either fax it in or bring it in manually to your loan officer. But with the advent of technology and the advent of innovation, we're able to connect a borrower's bank account directly to the loan application, and things that would otherwise take maybe a couple of days for back and forth to occur can happen in like 5 or 10 seconds or less. So I really think that these are just a few examples that technology has the opportunity to play a bigger role in making homeownership more accessible. And then last but not least, not sure if this is on Blend's roadmap, but if it's not, you should probably consider adding it, because I think it's really going to help make Blend even more accessible. I always thought the homeownership journey ended with when you bought the house. But after buying my house, I realized that there's so much more to homeownership than like buying the place. There's everything to do with like moving in, living in it, repairing in it. And as a person with a disability, a lot of those things are very, very inaccessible to me. So given companies like Blend or companies like Blend might have a lot of that data that has maybe the appliance that is in the house. When is that appliance up for warranty? Those are all the same things that technology companies can then link to repair people who may be certified to fix those things. Therefore, that extends the home ownership journey and making it more accessible. It's called home as a service. It's a really big industry that's only getting bigger and bigger, and kind of dovetails into like the smart home concept. And then last but not least, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't put in a plug for Mux. After I left Blend as a product manager, I joined a company called Mux. We look to power online video. So you can think of Mux as the Stripe or Twilio or Plaid for online video. And in working with a lot of our customers, one of the things that I'm finding to be true is how great video can be in making things more accessible. Different people have different learning modalities. Some people can't read a long document, and you can only imagine the number of rules and regulations that occur in mortgages. So if mortgages in the mortgage application process could better integrate video dynamically, interactively in the mortgage application process, the approval process, the post home ownership process, that really could make the home ownership process a little bit more accessible. So, and if you're interested, check out Mux. So in wrapping up, the advice I would have for borrowers and the advice that I would have for lenders. So borrowers, like technology, I would just say embrace it, learn as much as possible about it, find the lenders who are actively pushing the envelope forward on it. It's not going to be perfect the first time. And like, don't get discouraged if like everything is not there at the very beginning, but continue to push and demand it to get better. And then on the lender side, also embrace technology, but don't think it's the end all be all. In addition to technology, lenders should think about how they can leverage their influence on the other two pillars of what makes it more accessible, both society and government. And what do I mean by that? So as I'd shared, in order to get a mortgage, you have to provide verification of your income. And certain types of income are more easily verifiable by some of these third-party integrations that I had shared. If you're like a standard W-2 wage earner, then a lot of Blend's integrations work really, really well for you. But if you're a little bit more off the cuff or non-standard in income, and that is often the case for people with disabilities, whether you're on disability income, self-employment, a lot of 1099 contract workers, that verification of income isn't as seamless. So technology companies should really use their influence and leverage to help push legislation forward to make other types of income more accessible and make those types of legislation better. And yeah, and I think those are the main things I wanted to cover. But super excited to be here and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jan. I thought 90 minutes was a long time, but we're going to run out of time. There's so many things to talk about. I am now going to turn to Nick's remarks. I have her remarks, which I will read to the group. Nick, is there anything, please add in the chat as I speak if there's anything to add, but is there anything you want to add in the chat before I read your remarks? Great. Thank you, Nick. I will now start reading Nick's remarks. As a deaf person, I need to use the relay service to call and speak with the mortgage company or the bank. The one I had to deal with refused to take my relay calls. I had no one to contact to get assistance as I lived alone. My husband had died a year prior, and in my grief process, after getting hung up on or refused service by my mortgage broker, I had no choice but to take the low road and refuse to pay my mortgage until they were willing to communicate with me using accommodations that are provided for under the ADA law. I lost a lot of money hiring an attorney who disappeared on me, and the EEOC closed the case after the mortgage company said they revised their policy to accommodate the deaf. It was too late for me to get my home back as the bank sold it and I spent 4 years cleaning up my credit. Had I been a hearing person, I would have been able to refinance my mortgage over the phone with the equity built up and overpayments on my part for a lower payments and would have rented out my house. I tried to apply for a pre-approval and several banks have declined due to my credit being ruined because I'm deaf. As a person with a disability, I don't earn the same salary as my peers who are hearing and unable to qualify for a mortgage. I gave up a few years ago on owning a home as a single deaf woman, since I can't get help that I need to be successful. I lost over $150,000 in selling my late husband's home, which adds another trigger. Too many people took advantage of my disabilities as well as my grief process. That concludes Nick's prepared remarks. Nick, I want to thank you so much for sharing that with us, and just leave a few moments for any anything you want to add in the chat before we move into some moderated questions. Thank you for sharing that. Just so everyone knows, I called the mortgage company a few times monthly for 8 months before I refused to pay my mortgage. Before we go to the planned questions, just because this is such a powerful example and story, I kind of, not to put the lawyers on the spot, and Ashley, I know it's not legal advice at all. I get that, and I appreciate your caveat at the top. I just wonder if you have any reactions to Nick's story from your backgrounds and having worked with various clients. Either of you, you can decide. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll dive in real quick. It's heartbreaking to hear that happens. It's not entirely surprising based on what I've seen before. I have actually spoken with and worked with 3 individuals who were in a similar position in years prior before I met them, who similarly, after one was over a year trying to speak with the mortgage company. I've had people, especially during COVID and the pandemic, trying to negotiate these things as well. And due to a lack of basic training by those in customer service at a lot of these companies, as well as the lack of understanding about disability in general, or the options for accommodating the process and making it accessible, people are left without real options in their minds. And so, I know on my social media, I share a lot of kind of legal options for everybody that's in a wide variety of disability discrimination scenarios. Like you said, of course, it's best to find a lawyer in your area. But that being said, one of the reasons I became a lawyer, and Angela can probably speak to this too, is that as a disabled woman, and as a counselor prior to becoming a lawyer, I couldn't find a lawyer who truly understood disability or even knew how to make the legal process accessible. So when we're saying to people, you know, find a lawyer in your area, I understand it's not that easy, especially to find one that's qualified in disability rights. And so for that reason, one of the things that I often do is if you are dealing with any type of legal situation, if I can't help you, I will find a lawyer who can. I spent a lot of time talking to other lawyers in other states, trying to find and really kind of vet out these lawyers who can provide competent counsel instead of people say, oh yeah, I can help you with that. And then people like Nicole are dealing with loss of money, not only and loss of assets with the home, but also in legal fees that can usually in many ways be avoided. So those are just kind of my basic thoughts with that.
I'll jump into tag team with Ashley. One thing I totally echo, I did become an attorney because even attorneys who are well engaged in civil rights, disability is a whole new thing. It's a whole different analysis. It's far more complicated. It's also fairly new. I know it sounds kind of odd, but when you're dealing with, you know, civil rights legislations back in the 60s, and the first real major legislation, the original ADA was in 1990. That's still new for the legal community. Okay, so you could be a civil rights attorney in 30 years and not know anything about disability law. So I just want to put that out there. One thing I do recommend people, and I do this often to kind of gauge somebody's from a lawyer, their legal expertise is, you know, ask them if they know about the amendment to the ADA. That's telling, and for those who are not lawyers out there, there was Americans with Disability Act in 1990, but then an amendment happened in 2010. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ashley. I believe it was 2010. Okay, 2010, and that was a breakthrough because it overruled 3 Supreme Court cases, as in the preamble. And that's never been done before. And so if you're looking for an attorney, ask them what they know about the amendment to the ADA. If they go, what do you mean? Probably not a good lawyer. It means they're not keeping up with the legislation. Also, if we're talking about housing, you know, ask them what's the difference between ADA and the Fair Housing Act. Unfortunately, you should not have to be able to do that as a potential client. You should be able to call them up if they got on the website saying they do disability law, but from a disabled person and also a legal community, those are kind of a few questions I would ask them to weed them out, because I did see a comment, somebody said, you know, disability lawyers are a dime a dozen, and unfortunately I do agree with that. So hopefully by asking those questions, you can at least weed out those who really know the law and those who just kind of muddle their way through it. Maybe not out of malice, but just lack of inexperience and not wanting to convey that to you. And I heard something about credit. Don't forget about, you know, I think it's a consumer protection agency. They were born from the market crash of housing crash. And so they're very big into credits and help you walk through that. And you can even file a complaint directly with them. I mean, I don't know, obviously I'm not giving legal advice for individual things, but you know, when you're talking credit and you're talking housing, I mean, that was one of the main reasons why that federal agency was created. So I will also advise people to look into that as well.
Thank you, guys. I just want to give Nick a minute to reply if there's anything you want to put in the chat. Okay. I have some pre-planned questions. I want to say, though, one thing that's becoming clear to me as I'm listening to everyone is, we talked in the beginning, Antonia talked about Blend, and, I'm psyched to be working at Blend because of taking the friction out of blending. There's a lot of friction to living with a disability, and there's a lot of hurdles that you guys have identified, and we can't catalog them all here, and they're all very different, and there are different requirements. I just wonder, for those of you that have gone through this process of purchasing a home, the panelists, what would you have done differently, thinking about those that maybe are on an earlier path? I have a bit of a softball response myself, but I want to hear what you guys would say.
I'll jump in, since that's kind of catalyst of my book of lessons learned. Unfortunately, be more prepared on the micro steps. I was so focused on financing aspect of it. Can I buy a home? Can I find money for the modifications? Where do I want to live? My wish list that you hear all the real estate shows and things like that. I did not think foolishly about how do I work with my realtor? How do I work with my bank? How do I communicate? How do I weed out a contractor that can actually do modifications? And what, learning the terminology of universal design, and just really, really educating myself for that way, because no one comes prepared. I haven't, I write in my book, every realtor that the few I did get, to respond to me, and I dropped my call after the third time, they didn't even have, an idea, I might want to bring a ramp for a house that only has 1 or 2 steps. And so I just kind of say, I'll just go to housewarming things, and it just kind of muddle my way through. And instead of creating my own toolbox and really thinking every single step on how I work with all the players in it, and knowing their terminology, and then being able to figure out a way to communicate the disability terminology, because they're not going to come prepared. So that's what I would do, is instead of just thinking of financing and modifications and where I want to live, break it up from A to Z. And that's what I would have done. I wasted so much time, thinking that a realtor will call me back with, I found a ramp, probably could get into this house, and they never did. And so I ended up buying my own ramp, and, that's what I would have done in differently. I just assumed that, when I explained to them what I need, that in time they will come back, especially during the housing market crash, when many realtors were not employed, right? And there were so many houses on the market, they were dying to get them off. And so that's what I foolishly, I should have stepped back, and knowing that I should have probably done a little bit more preparedness.
Yeah, I can add to that.
I bet you
I'd
could.
say, I would say, to dovetail on one of the comments that Angela made, I would say start now, start early. I think a lot of the comments in the chat had alluded to around how the market's so hot with interest rates so low, so you feel like you're missing out. And the last thing you want to be as a buyer is chasing a market that's going up. Because you can look at the markets in 05 to July of 07, and you could have felt the same way, but who would have known that 07 was going to be the top of the market in 07? And then you could have said the same thing at many other points in history. So you want to be purchasing from a place of abundance, and not because you need it. But obviously, all the circumstances are different, and it's so. If you don't, I guess my advice would be, if you don't think you want to buy a house in the next 0 to 5 years, I would still start looking, because you never know when you'll want to, and it's a long process to get comfortable to it. And the second thing that I would say, having gone through the process myself, and I think this dovetails a lot of the comments that the panelists here had said, is if you can find a good referral, do. Especially folks who have had experience working on behalf of owners or for sellers who have a disability. the realtor market, the loan officer market is there's a long tail. Not to disparage anyone, but like you just have to take a test and do a lot of other things. But it's there's a lot of good loan officers and realtors out there, but then there's also like a lot of bad loan officers and realtors out there. And that's the case with like any profession. But given that you're going to be working on a transaction that probably is one of the largest transactions that you'll make in your lifetime, maybe aside from college tuition, maybe, it would behoove you not only to be prepared and think for the long term, but also go with someone who you know you can trust. And so not everyone might have the benefit of having a friend who went through the process or having an aunt who's a realtor. But the sooner you start, the sooner you even let people know that you're in the market for it. You'd be surprised how the universe works. There's that quote, like the universe conspires to give you what you want. And so the more you put it out there, you would be surprised. The realtor recommendations or referrals, loan officer recommendations or referrals that might just come from your network. So start early, and to the extent possible, go with someone that you know or feel like you can trust.
Thanks, Yen. Ashley, do you have anything you want to add on?
Sorry, so I was just actually typing something relating to kind of planning long-term. I know Yen was talking about, even if you're not thinking about buying a home now or in the next 0 to 5 years, looking in the future, always kind of keeping a lookout for those types of opportunities. Another main issue that I see affecting disability homeownership is the fact that many disabled individuals can't or decide not to get married because of loss of benefits. And so I often hear people say, I can't save up the money to purchase a home, or if I can't get married because I don't want to lose these vital life-saving disability benefits, then I'm missing out on the legal protections afforded to married homeowners in many states. And so I just think that's an important part of the discussion, where a lot of people who are in the disability community are also planning long-term when it comes to the nature of their relationships, and that can have a huge impact on homeownership.
I don't even know where to begin responding to that. Actually, that's not something I had thought about in terms of long-term planning. I definitely think that's for me, that's something that totally resonates. I wish I had been more forceful in being honest about what I wanted. I want a ranch home. I do not want a home with stairs, because I'm constantly thinking about what happens in the incidents that my caretaker needs to support me in my mobility. And finally, I'm in a ranch home and I'm so much happier and less stressed about that dynamic. So maybe having just been honest about that earlier with myself. And then also in terms of long-term planning, I wanted to talk to you guys about I'm glad you used that term long-term, Ashley, about whether or not you thought about, or you've talked to folks in this community about the long-term wealth generation and equity opportunity. Ashley, you talked about the budgeting of someone with a disability and how expensive it can be. And I'm certainly still learning that, it is expensive, but that also makes me want to have an asset with equity and the stability that provides. But it cuts both ways, because it's harder to save because I have very high medical expenses. So I don't know if you guys want to tackle that puzzle of, component.
I'll dive right in. In one of my podcast episodes, so in my episodes, I have real world kind of conversations, right? And in one of the episodes, I mentioned about, there's a huge push for a very good reason to be gainfully employed. And one thing I wish I would have done, even though I went to law school, is so much of all social programs in general, not just for housing, but in general, are focused for low income. And it's actually better, to get into those programs, because once you're out of them, it's really, then you're stuck in between this rock and a hard place, right? Where now you're employed, but the employment's not covering all your costs, and now you don't get any the social benefits. And so I just have a real kind of conversation is that, while, I definitely want the disability community to be gainfully employed and be in a working class, but you really have to look at what benefits are out there based on your own medical needs and what are the economic thresholds before diving into, getting a promotion. So for example, for me, I knew the state of Maryland had this homeownership program. Luckily, it was a medium average based on the county, and I was below that, but I was bidding on a house, I was up for promotion, and I declined the promotion because I didn't want my salary to be over that cap, okay? So, I mean, that's like, 5 levels down the road thinking, but, I had done that research. And so there is that sort of dichotomy of, we all want to get out of the low income and things like that. Sometimes you need to get into those programs, especially since those programs have a grace period sometimes. So if you time that out, but the devil's in the details. So being mindful of that. And then one thing I put in the chat that really has just happened in the last, I think, 5 years is the ABLE Act. So for those people who are on Social Security disability, or people like myself who became disabled before the 27th birthday, you can have, and this is a federal account where you can put in up to $15,000 if you're working or not working, $15,000, and if it will not count against your Social Security disability. So many of you who may be on it, you know that you can only have like something like $2,000, bank account or something ridiculously small amount of money. And this whole act was designed to prevent, to allow people to start saving some money. And it's a national program. I was on the Maryland task force for Maryland, because each state has to adopt how they're going to run the program. So you can reach out to me. There's also ableact.org out there, and it can roll over up to $100,000. So what I'm saying to everybody is that if you're on Social Security disability, no matter how you get the money, whether it's from yourself or given to whoever, you put this in this account, and you can use it for anything that's disability related. And that's beyond medical, okay? That's the whole idea that being disabled is expensive. So if you need to modify your home or you need to buy your home, mortgage, it's very loosely, I just bought a handicap van. So you can use that money that you have saved or has been gifted to you, and it can roll up to $100,000. So that is landmark. And I truly believe anybody that's on Social Security disability or disabled for the 27th birthday, we should all have an ABLE Act account, because there really is no downside to it. So that can also help you start planning for your home without losing your Social Security disabilities. Just make sure you look into your state to make sure they also, if there's any state benefits that you don't get away, that you don't lose that. In the state of Maryland, they say we follow the Social Security disability, that the money's not going to count against your state benefits, but that's a state specific thing. So look into that.
Thanks, Angela. Ashley, Yen, anything on this kind of broader topic of long-term financial planning and homeownership and how that affected your thinking?
I think what I'd add from the technology or innovation, financial engineering perspective, is there are more and more companies, and I know this is more than just an affordability challenge. There are other challenges beyond affordability, but just talking about affordability for a second, there are a lot of companies that are out there who will help enable fractional ownership or put part of the down payment for you, and they participate in the upside of the home as well. So I think programs like that actually replicate a lot of the programs that are in the VA or FHA, I think are programs that people should explore. And I believe as like blockchain becomes more and more mainstream, at least that's my hot take on it, I think fractional home ownership and fractional ownership of other assets will be more and more prevalent. And so that will help you begin to accumulate the equity in the house, so you can begin being an owner a little bit sooner than you otherwise would be. had fractional ownership not been as prevalent or as accessible.
Great, thanks, Danh. Ashley?
Yeah, if I could just add one more thing to keep in mind, especially if you, I hate this term special needs, but if your parents or guardians set up a special needs trust for you, that's what they've typically been called. I call them disability trusts with my clients. Or if you set one up for yourself, you want to make sure that you are being really careful about what you use the money for, or if you have a home and you sell it and you're putting the funds into a trust that was set up for, disability protections. You want to make sure that you're abiding by all of those rules as well, because you really don't want to violate those rules, because it could allow creditors to come after those assets. It could allow you to lose some assets. And so I would just keep in mind that if you have other trusts or different types of accounts set up to save your assets, just be really mindful of that as you're navigating homeownership too.
One last thing that I'll add, and I feel like this is blending or bleeding towards like personal finance tips, but I think it's related in that obviously not everyone has parents who might be in the position to have property or estates to pass on, but I'm getting to the age where my parents are getting to that age where I've actually been helping them through the estate planning process. So to the extent that people here have parents, grandparents who are getting to that age, in the interest of helping their wishes of how their estate gets passed down, often which is in the form of property, there's a lot of value and work that can be done in helping your elders, your parents or grandparents set up trusts that are very intentional about where the assets go. So you don't end up having your parents' property go through multiple probate courts before it gets to you. And maybe that might have been their original intention anyway. So another thing that you can start early can sometimes be an awkward conversation with your parents if they haven't done it already. But I firmly believe everyone should have a trust, whether or not you have assets or not.
I am starting to understand why Angela and Ashley became lawyers. There's so many topics and ways to take this conversation. There are just so many component parts to talk through. Before we move to audience for questions, which I really want to do next, I just want to acknowledge that there's a ton to talk about. There's a ton of work to be done. And there's a ton of work to do to make the homeownership journey more inclusive for people with disabilities. And having a dedicated conversation about that is important, and it's important to continue it. So just before we go to audience questions, given that context, where should we start? If each of you had to pick one initiative to focus our energy on first, what would it be? Angela, you don't like that question. Too many things.
That's a tough one. Honestly, because I'm a legal person, so I think this idea of making homes accessible, really depends. We really need to look at the Fair Housing Act. It's just outdated. It's not. So much of housing accessibility is either based on whether or not federal or state funds are being used, or if it's new construction. And Ashley, correct me or not, I think it's new construction with more than four units or something like that, but either something like that. And so this means for everybody is that when houses, basically single family homes are off the market, right? Because single family homes are not more than one unit. And they, one thing that I participate in for Kesley Foundation, it's actually my mug. And there was a Raise the Roof program, and it was talking, educating about housing and things like that. And that's why most housing is built by private funds, developers. So once a disability organization gets involved, we want to build all these single family homes to be, somewhat accessible. There's no requirement, and there's no requirement when, let's say, a house is basically unlivable and you have what I call flipper buying a house, to renovate it and sell it, they're not required to make it accessible, even though there are minor things that they could do that could really open the door, like not having any steps in front of the house. And so for my first step would be is to really look at the Fair Housing Act along with the ADA, but the ADA is really for about public access, and really make housing, regardless of funding, regardless of type of it is, really make some accessibility requirements required. There was a great national organization called Concrete Change. Unfortunately, the founder decided to dissolve it 5 or 6 years ago, but she was going around trying to convince states to adopt legislation that any new home would require 0 steps, a half bathroom, and 1 bedroom on the floor with wider doorways. That way, it's be accessible for a homeowner and also people who may be visiting somebody that lives in that house. And so we're just trying to get those 3 things required. So I think simple things like that would be the way to really go through it, because it's just so costly for a future disabled home buyer to manage buying a home. Like I could afford so much more of a house, but I had to buy a smaller house because I had to come up with funds for modifications, even though I'm considered, the middle upper class, which is crazy, right? So that's what I would do, but that's because I'm illegally, so.
I love it. Well thought through. Ashley?
Yeah, I co-sign everything that Angela said. For me, I also would love to, because so many of the legal protections put this huge burden on you as the disabled person to prove that there's this nexus between your disability and the modification you're requesting, or that the accommodation you're requesting is reasonable. There's a lot of, please, can you give me my rights, that's required of the individual. And so while I think we should all be as self-determinative as possible and empowered to navigate the journey on our own, I would love to see more real estate professionals and lenders have a thorough knowledge of disability rights and realize that it's good for their business to know these things and to implement them, and that it's going to be a more enjoyable experience for them from a business perspective, as well as the buyers or even sellers with disabilities. So it benefits everybody to know these things, but it's also kind of in my mind, the bare minimum that's required to be qualified to work in the profession. And so I would love to see more of that burden carried by non-disabled people or professionals that are working in this type of environment. But I'd also think that a huge improvement that could happen with homeownership is, again, tackling that very difficult issue of unemployment or underemployment with disabled individuals, which is so complicated. And I know we're not going to solve that on this panel tonight, but I think the more that we can push for equality in employment, the better that the disability community is going to be able to access homeownership overall.
Yeah, and you want to provide one thing that you change immediately, or do you want me to go to audience questions?
Yeah, I can. I'll just double click on the previous comment that I made about fractional home ownership. I really think that could really help unlock, like, there are other challenges that Ashley and Angela and the panelists have mentioned, but barring those challenges, something that will level the playing field a little bit more is that it would make not only the market more liquid, and so that it would increase supply, so that you wouldn't have to sell your whole house. You could sell parts of your house, or like 1/8 of your house, some random arbitrary fraction of your house. But as like a recent college grad who might not have that much money, instead of paying $1,700 per month to live in Russian Hill in San Francisco, maybe I could buy 1/10 of a place in the Mission, and that's a down payment that I could afford and a mortgage towards that I could make, such that over time, after 3 years, instead of being out of pocket essentially like $72,000 worth of rent, I could now have accreted equity in 10% of a house. And then that you can then build on that to buy the next property. And I think it's good for everyone. It's good for the home buyers and it's good for the home sellers. But obviously there's a lot of technological challenges at play, whether it's like deed, title, and all of the machinations that I know Blend is tackling right now. But I really think like a true fractional home ownership would help alleviate a lot of the challenges around accessibility, at least from a affordability perspective.
That's great. I love the technology perspective, helping us imagine new futures, new realities. All right, I'm going to turn to some audience questions. Antonia is sending me these that you guys have sent in. They're questions that have come in from the audience. So what do you think are some of the misconceptions that disabled people have around owning a home? For example, I think many of us assume that it's cost prohibitive for us. What are some of those misconceptions?
Well, I guess I'll jump on in. I think some of the misconceptions, and it kind of depends where you're at in stage of life, meaning I hear often people that are coming, become disabled much later in life, right before, being a senior citizen, is this fear that not being able to live independently in a home, something may happen, and I think that's, a misconception that while a lot of services are geared for senior citizens, they're not really long-term services in the home. Okay, they're just piecemeal, and so I think there is a push just generally from the way things work to go into assisted living centers that may or may not provide that. I also think managing a home. I do a lot of mentorship. A lot of fear with that, and I tell anybody that if I hate to use the word active because I think it's so degrading, but active disabled person could just make me want to throw up. But active disabled person, you're employed, you're shaking and moving. I promise you, managing a home is no less. In fact, you're probably more prepared than a new homeowner because you know how to pick up a phone and you know how to contact people to get your services or to explain what you need because you're out and about. For me, I'm gonna, it's no different. Setting up a housekeeper, setting up a contractor, and so just kind of getting over that. And then also, I think, like I said earlier, a lot of people think that, with HUD and things like that, that there are specific houses that are available, that are accessible for people to buy, and they're not. They don't exist. You have to be in a HUD program. The HUD money that's provided, the 203, is for you to buy that home, and you're going to have to modify. So I think it's those three things.
Okay, great. I don't want to miss anyone by missing things in the chat. So if you guys have questions, can you just raise your hand and I will call on you. Antonia, please help me monitor because I'm never sure if I can see everyone.
Will do. Looks
Ashley.
Like yeah.
Ashley, you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hi. I just wanted to know from Angela, what was the cost like down the road of getting into that housing program and having to lose out on that promotion? Because that's my biggest concern right now. I do live in the state of Maryland. I'm currently gainfully employed with the federal government, so I'm just trying to figure out, like, okay, like, should I keep getting promotions and taking that route, or, like you said, very much boxing myself into having enough income to afford to keep renting for the rest of my life, but not owning anything because I can't make the modifications. Much like you, I have a physical disability, so I would need something that is like, has a ramp and everything like that. Ranch style, the whole deal. Lower countertops, all that.
Yeah. So in the state of Maryland, they based it. It's really based on which county you're buying the home at, as far as the requirements. So I live. I don't know if you live in Montgomery County like I do. but it's based on
Yes, ma'am, I do. So please speak
all
to.
right. Well, hey, well, definitely email me. I'll walk you through it. But it's based on the median salary of the county of Montgomery County. I will tell you it's a little dated. I've been hounding them to update that, but there's been no push. So that's some advocacy on the side. And then the amount of money you can borrow is also depending on where the house is located at. And that, unfortunately, is I got lucky because I bought my house during the market crash. I'll tell you right now, the amount in it's like something ridiculously low amount, like I want to say like $350 or $375 is the maximum amount of loan you could get for the house, which with the low interest rates, that's not going to cover hardly anything outside of a condo. And so that's kind of a little bit of Debbie Downer. And you only have to put down a $500 down payment. If you do qualify underneath those, that $500 could be gifted, and you can loop in all of your closing costs, including your inspections, which is why I did. So you can then use that money that you might have saved up for a down payment and all the incidental, fees you have to deal with. You can just loop that into the loan outside of the modification. And then for modification, I went through the Mailer Assisted Technology Loan Program. If you go through that, technically it is a home equity loan credit. However, I challenged that because that affected people like us who had to buy a new home and won't have any equity, and so they will make an exemption for an unsecured loan. If they don't contact me, because I was invited to be on the board for 4 years after I raised that issue, they changed that policy. And I just finished my tenure in a year this past August. So you'll have to go through 2 separate. I asked for $20,000 because I had like 10 or 15 saved myself. That I plan to use it as a down payment until I found a Maryland home ownership program. So, and that included putting a new driveway, making a ramp, doing a brand new wheelchair accessible bathroom, and a few things in the kitchen as well. So hopefully, but feel free to email me, and I also talk about it in my book too.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We just got a question in the chat. John, do you want to ask this or do you want me to read it? I like this question. How can I advertise in a way that lets the disabled community know that I'm able to help them without seeming pushy or offensive? I'd like to surround myself with a team of inclusion-friendly vendors and become a one-stop shop, lending, buying, repairs. I like this question about how to communicate. Yeah.
Yeah, so as part of my vocational rehabilitation background, we often talk about accessibility in media as well as in advertising. And so some of the basic things that you can do as in advertising in general, making sure that when you're thinking about whether you're advertising on social media or in print, I know print is like kind of outdated nowadays, but a lot of people are doing it on social media. You're thinking about all the ways that people are going to consume that media. So making sure that if somebody isn't seeing your content, you're putting things like image descriptions and transcripts, either in the post, in the comments, or on your website. That's a really great start. You can also reach out to members of the disability community who have presented themselves as consultants like myself, but also with a wide variety of disabilities, because you want to make sure that you're not just focusing on one disability subgroup, because for you, you'd be missing out on millions of potential customers if you do that. But essentially sitting down, what I tell a lot of people, a lot of different businesses is, if you aren't visually looking at this, how are you consuming the content? If you're not hearing the content, how are you consuming the content? And just going by senses. But then also making sure that you are being diverse in where you're publishing your ads as well. There are tons of disability organizations that might be good places to advertise, but you also want to make sure that you're advertising in a wide variety of arenas, because people with disabilities consume content on different platforms. And so some people in here might have some experience with the new Clubhouse app, but that's not been as accessible to a lot of people with disabilities, at least originally. And so, you know, Zoom has captions now, but for a long time it didn't. And so you just want to make sure that whatever platform you're using, that you're going through all of the senses and you're taking the basic steps to do your research, but then reaching out to the experts and actual people with disabilities for input.
And I'll echo what Ashley says, you know, making sure your advertisement is accessible. But I also think using the right, meet people where they are. So we'll talk about home ownership, right? And so if you say disability home ownership, it's going to be very challenging to really get people involved. But if you say things like age in place, right? You know, age in place is just a fancy way of saying people who are planning to become disabled, okay? But we say age in place, but we say seniors, you know, really trying to think about those. And unfortunately, there's a lot of making real estate able friendly, as I call, instead of just saying you're a senior citizen planning to have a accessible house, we say age in place. Being familiar with universal design, and really making sure that if you are presenting yourself as someone that can assist future disabled homeowners or working with realtors or whatnot, that you know what the disability needs are. I can't tell you how many times I went to realtors who happen to have, and they might help 1 or 2 people buy a condo who were in a wheelchair, and they thought that they knew how to, you know, help somebody, you know, look for a home, and that just really help their grandma or their grandpa, things like that. So they don't really look at, you know, what makes a kitchen, what things do you want to be accessible in the kitchen, what things would you want things to be accessible in a bathroom. And so when you're advertising or you're working with realtors or you're working with contractors, making sure that when they advertise, they are playing those specific things, like, you know, a walk-in bathtub, you know, having a mirror to look down a lower kitchen sinks, you know, being very specific is really, really important, because otherwise so many people say that they want to be diversely inclusive and they may have 1 or 2 good experiences, but they could help guide somebody who may be recently disabled on knowing what he or she may need. And they tend to maybe work with bulk rehab, which is great, but you really need to be mindful of what you are advertising and making sure that you basically prove to the disability community you know what you're talking about.
So unfortunately, guys, we've run out of time. There's so much to talk about. I want folks to be able to follow up via email or on social. Panelists, can you drop your emails and or social accounts in the chat so folks have those in case they have questions? I want to thank everyone, our wonderful, knowledgeable, experienced panelists for all of their thoughts today, and our organizers, Diversability, the Blend team. Thank you very much for bringing this together. And thank you all for participating and giving us your time to, you know, have this important conversation.
Everyone.